Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Charitable Perspective. I'm Trevor Miller. This week, we're going to take a look at a couple different items that is going to really help you when you're looking at your portfolios. We're going to take a look at the bond markets, what bonds actually are, why they've been such a drain on your portfolio the last number of years, and what you can do about it. We're also going to take a look at how the banks are treating greenwashing and what they're doing with their accounting practices to try and make it look like they're doing a better job for the environment than what they were. And finally, we're going to take a look at Crawford Lake here close to where I am. I'm in Burlington. It's about a 20-minute drive north of us. Crawford Lake could be signaling the start of a new geological era. So have fun, enjoy. We've just turned the calendar over on the hottest month in recorded history and possibly the warmest month in the last 120,000 years, according to climate scientists. In Canada, we're seeing a wildfire season that has been the worst on record and has taken the life of a third firefighter who was trying to battle the fires. In fact, the United Nations Secretary General declared this week that the era of global warming has ended and the era of global boiling has arrived. Pretty bold statements, but you know, we have set some pretty crazy records here this last month. Also, we have a major spike in ocean temperatures, which has alarmed scientists. A recent study has suggested that global warming has caused a major circulation system in the Atlantic Ocean to collapse, which is also furthering what we're seeing here on this heat wave. The U.S. president commented that climate change is an essential threat last week and took some pretty drastic measures to help improve things by giving extra access to drinking water and then planting some more trees. Now, I've watched a few end-of-the-world movies, and at any time there was an existential threat, whether it be an asteroid hurling towards the planet or an alien invasion, the world wasn't saved by the hero just planting a few trees. Now, the point of this isn't to debate whether global warming is happening or not. We're definitely at a point where the world is changing, and it's extremely likely that we're the major player in these changes. We're also at a point now, though, where we understand the science behind what contributes to greenhouse gases, and the technology is here to replace many of those issues. Some of them are still in infancy, but you know we're definitely getting there with a lot of this. In October of 2022, Oxfam released a report that after examining the major Canadian banks and their pledge to go carbon neutral, they found that none of the 8 banks had a real plan to get to carbon neutral by 2050. But this was probably the least shocking revelation in the whole report. So taking the debate out of global warming, whether this is happening or not, which can be a contentious topic for some people, I think most of us would agree that pollution in itself is just not a good thing. And whether we're unsure of the impact of this pollution on the global warming, probably still not awesome overall. Since the Paris Agreement in 2015, countries and companies have all pledged to reduce their carbon footprints. Many have put timelines and action plans into this pledge. Banks and many of the major corporations on the globe are attempting to create accounting measures to calculate their impact of carbon emissions. An agreed standard was created called the ISO 14064, and even though the name leaves much to be desired, it really attempts to set measurables for accounting and reporting purposes. This will allow us as consumers and investors a benchmark where determining where to spend and invest our money. This past week, the major U.S. banks have released details on how they're going to account for the carbon footprint linked to their capital market business. Carbon accounting is essentially that every company measures the carbon emissions that they are directly or indirectly responsible for due to their activities. And without a universal rule book, it's really possible to determine whether companies are making good on their promises. So the banks have come up with a new playbook, and here's what they're proposing. The group of banks that are working on standardizing the accounting practices have determined that excluding 2/3 of the carbon emissions, yes, 2/3 excluded from the accounting practice would be sufficient when looking at the emissions. They really seem to be concerned about having the carbon footprint overcounted. Now, there's no concerns from this group when counting the green credits, so that is counting all the activities and underwriting for the clean energy towards a reduction footprint, which they have calculated at 100%. All right, so what does this actually mean? I'm sure that we all see the flaws in counting the good behavior at 100% and then the bad behavior at 33%, but do the banks actually contribute to carbon issues? Great question. I'm glad you asked. In Canada, the largest 8 banks account for more than twice the total carbon footprint in Canada as a whole. So just let that sink in for a second. The 8 largest banks account for more than twice the total carbon footprint of Canada as a whole. And I get, Canada is pretty environmentally focused as a country, so, it might not really be that bad. However, if Canada's biggest banks were a country, it would be the fifth largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world. The banks covered in the Oxfam study were TD, RBC, Scotiabank, BMO, CIBC, National Bank, Desjardins, and Laurentian Bank. TD was by far the worst contributor in this group, funding an equivalent of 446 million tons of carbon dioxide per year, followed by RBC at 369 million tons. Now, looking back in 2020, these 8 banks contributed to more than 1.9 billion tons of carbon weight. So in another context, for every $1,000 that you save at a Canadian bank, you're contributing to 1/3 of a ton of greenhouse gas per year. With direct lending from the major banks, they do their accounting and account for 100% of the carbon footprint through that side of thing. But the capital markets, they're looking to get a bit of a break on this side. And that really makes sense from the bank's perspective, since the underwriting of bonds and equities makes up 61% of the funding to fossil fuel companies. As much as the banks would like to downplay their role in the greenhouse gas emission, it would be difficult, if not impossible, for the continued expansion of these companies without the role of the banks. As consumers, we need to be aware as the banks are packaging up the deals they've underwritten and are adding to the mutual funds and ETFs that they're using to sidestep their rules, and they're passing it down to us. Many of these, including funds focused on ESG and so-called green funds, are still not aligned with the Paris Agreement according to the Oxfam report. So these recent reports bring a couple things to light. First of all, we need to be aware of the type of investments we're participating in. Companies that display a lack of regard in their role for the system might not be the types of companies that deserve our money and to handle our investments. There are many companies that are taking these issues seriously, and they're still able to have great performance from their investments, even while adhering to the strict protocols. And finally, if and when this is passed, the reporting will be voluntary and industry-led. So not only do the banks not have to adhere to these guidelines, but they're also essentially the ones setting these rules. It's really difficult to take ESG responsible investing seriously when the fox is in charge of the henhouse. Very often when we look at investment portfolios, it's the stock market that really gets the headlines. We tend to look at the results of companies that we're familiar with and take note of whether the stock price has risen or fallen. On a typical balanced portfolio, the stock portion accounts for 60% of the total investments. So what about that 40%? This fixed income portion is often not thought about a whole lot. And for the past decade or so, why would you? For the 10-year span ending in December of 2022, the U.S. aggregate has returned a total of 1.06% per year, while the global aggregate has performed at a loss of 0.44%. With returns like this, why has it been such a big part of your portfolio? If we look back at history, there have been periods where having a fixed income portfolio made sense, but with the low interest rate era that we've been in the past little while, bonds have really sucked the life out of many of our portfolios, giving up valuable return potential in the best case scenarios and contributing to losses like what we saw last year and in more of those worst case scenarios. In the simplest of forms, bonds are loans. Governments and corporations and other entities look to raise funds and issue a bond, which we as investors purchase. The bond has a promise to pay a certain interest rate over a prescribed period of time. So, for example, you can buy a 5-year bond that pays out 3% a year. Major issues can happen, as we saw last year, if you're looking to get out of your bond as rates are getting higher. If you're looking to sell that bond that has a payout of that 3%, you can now get a new bond paying out a higher rate, say 5%. You're going to have to sell that as a loss because no one want to buy something from you that's paying out less than what they can get on the open market. Many banks, like Bank of America, for example, hold bonds as a safety net. But in the rising interest rate world, they're holding about $760 billion in government debt and mortgage bonds, and this contributes to an unrealized loss of nearly $110 billion. As rates have risen, it's been more attractive to hold bonds as payouts have been more than we've seen in years gone by. However, for every interest rate rise, the bonds you've purchased previously now have become less attractive, and if you need to sell, they would be at a loss as well. There are strategies that could implement, such as buying laddered bonds or investing in less committal options like high interest savings funds. Some of them are high interest savings accounts. You get some ETFs and things like that. An alternative to the public credit markets is private credit. In light of the recent bank issues in the U.S., including the SVB and Signature Bank collapses, there have been a tightening of lending policies across the U.S. Even in Canada, we're seeing a new cap on the home equity lines of credit, making it more difficult to access equity in your home. JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon commented that companies that offer private credit will be dancing in the streets with these new rules. Companies have typically gone to the public markets to raise capital, but are now bypassing these markets and investment banks and going straight to the private lenders. We've already seen private credit as an asset class go to $1.5 trillion, which is bigger than the high-yield corporate bonds or leveraged loans. According to Bloomberg, the opportunities are just about to get even more exciting as the new financial regulations come into effect. Banks can see an average of 20% increase in their overall capital requirements, which could exclude them from offering loans at a similar rate. Many firms have typically existed only in the private market, such as BlackRock and SoftBank, are now venturing into the private credit world as well. When it comes to creating a diversified investment portfolio, ensuring that you have exposure to the credit markets is really important, but equally important is ensuring that you are as meticulous at choosing the right fixed income investment as you are with your stock portfolio. There's been a lot of conversation over the past few years about when the new chapter in Earth's history has began. The Anthropocene, or Age of the Humans, is the era that we're in right now, and scientists have been trying to determine when we started to impact the planet on a geographical level. Since 2009, an obscure scientific group called the Anthropocene Working Group has been accumulating evidence that the Earth's chemistry and climate are fundamentally different than that of the last several thousand years. The final requirement of this group was to identify what they call a golden spike, which is a spot in the geologic record that was preserved perfectly. According to the curator of the climate change at the Royal Ontario Museum, lakes are essentials of climate change. He says that nearly any lake on the planet contains many of the same Anthropocene markers across the same timeline. Crawford Lake in Milton, Ontario was chosen from a number of what they call golden spike candidates, which all possess the same simultaneous surge in human pollution around 1950. It was decided that Crawford Lake captured the evidence to signal the start of the new era better than any of the other candidates. In addition to nuclear fallout, the lake holds signs of industrial pollution, species extinctions, and global climate change. All previous epochs have been named millennia after they occurred. So, for example, a Tunisian cliff bearing evidence of ancient meteor impact signaled the end of the age of the dinosaurs, while the start of the Holocene is marked by molecules of hydrogen trapped in ancient Greenlandic ice. The evidence is found in Crawford Lake, according to the Anthropocene Working Group, is what they call undeniable. Although there are debates as to whether this is actually a new geological era, you can always take a short drive to Crawford Lake and just determine for yourself. Thank you for watching this week. Hopefully you learned something interesting about bonds and how to really take a good look at how that affects your portfolio, as well as what's going on with the banks and climate change and how they're looking to build out those accounting practices that are definitely swayed in their own advantages. Take that short drive out to Crawford Lake. Beautiful area, and maybe you'll learn something interesting about what geological era we're in. Until next week, take care. Look to talk to you soon. Bye now.